Hello everybody, my name is Omar Sabah, this is my co-host.
Hello, my name is Tariq Khelu, and welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, welcome everybody. So the goal of this podcast is to share and discuss some events and foster debates and also provide some entertainment, because what is a podcast without entertainment? The general rundown, we're going to try to keep this to about 30 minutes, and hopefully it'll be bi-weekly. We're going to switch back and forth between a live and pre-recorded format, and we'll see which one works best. But for now, I'm going to give you a more detailed introduction of Tariq, so take it away, Tariq.
So, I'm Tariq. I'm doing a master's program in global governance and political science here in Gothenburg, Sweden. As you might know, I was born in Curitiba, Brazil, to a Syrian family. My father is from Homs, and my mother was also born in Brazil, but her parents are from South Vita. Over time, I got up an interest for Middle Eastern politics, and that interest grew a lot after joining the Spicy community where I met Omar.
Yes, he did. And as for myself, I did 3 years of infantry and I'm still doing civil affairs humanitarian work for the government. I'm a year away from achieving my bachelor's degree in computer information systems, so I'm kind of all over the place. But the one thing that we both have in common is our interest in politics. And me and Tariq were discussing politics, and we decided that, a podcast would be a good idea for a myriad of reasons, and we're making it a reality. So, as for our first topic, it's going to be a little bit tricky and divisive, but we're going to try to keep it neutral and focus on facts, and that's going to be the Kurdish referendum and the situation in Kirkuk. So, like I said, this is gonna, maybe push some buttons, but we're gonna try to stay objective and not veer too much into edgelord territory. As for the referendum itself, in my personal opinion, I don't know what Barzani was thinking. It seems like it was purely to antagonize and solidify himself in the Kurdish political structure, as a hero. But I think he knew the repercussions, and he still followed through with it, knowing that it wasn't going to work out in the end.
So, well, as we all know, the referendum came with no surprise. It has been scheduled since June of this year and, well, made widely known throughout the region. We all know that Kurdish authorities have been pushing for independence for decades, and the general public is not far behind. They are obviously pro-independence. So much so that on the 25th of September, this last month, an overwhelming 92.7% of voters voiced their yes for independence. So why didn't it kick off? I mean, it was an overwhelming victory. Well, there are many factors, but the most important by far, and at least institutionally, is that it was not recognized nor spectated by any body of the United Nations. And if you want to become a member of the United Nations, you need, recognition from the United Nations. So this is where it gets tricky. Although most countries in the West believe that the Kurds should have the right to self-determination, the countries spamming today's regions of Kurdistan, namely Turkey, Iraq, Iran and Syria, would truly go a long length in putting down any kind of motion, any sort of unexpected measure that could enable an independent Kurdistan. These reasons run deep, and not only politically, but we'll come back to them later. After all, some could argue that the referendum was a failure. Some could argue that it was indeed a success in spreading awareness and recognition about today's Kurdish situation. But really, what will be concerning today is how this referendum made the Kurds come together, despite their many ideological differences, and hang under anything they could use as a common denominator to antagonize the Abadi regime, as you told us. In this moment, we surely know that this ended up in the offensive of Kirkuk that Omar will be discussing right now.
Yeah, in regards to the offensive on Kirkuk, like I said, I don't think Barzani expected this at all. I believe that he was antagonizing, and he was hoping that there would be some kind of foreign intervention, America saying, "Hey, Iraq, Abadi, stop doing this, stop interfering with the Kurds." But obviously, America has a large strategic investment in Iraq, alongside with Turkey. They want those domains free from obstacles, so that they can operate in Iran, and then they can operate in the region, against Syria. So it's kind of it was wishful thinking that America was going to intervene and stop this. Abadi was giving warnings consistently that they were going to do something and that the Kurds needed to hand over government installation and control over the refinery, but they didn't listen. And that kind of leads us to what happened in Kirkuk. Um, it was. I think we can both agree that it was a pretty staggering loss. Even if there wasn't a lot of conflict involved,
Yeah.
it was just embarrassing in terms of the retreat and what happened. It was kind of it's a mark on the Kurdish reputation. So this has polarized the Kurdish politics. I don't think Barzani's ever going to have the same influence that he's had pre the Kirkuk offensive. What do you think?
It was quite an unexpected and unmeditated offensive, that is to be sure. It came in the heat of the moment. I mean, all the Kurds were indeed very excited with the referendum, and given that they saw it was not resulting in anything, well, what can we do with all this morale right now? So they invaded, and it was, then again, it was not a very meditated offensive. It really indeed split the Kurds. There are even some records of Barzani not paying the salaries or any sort of compensation for those who fought in that offensive. So it just came out of pure hype, in a sense. They just went there and let's see if we can do this. We have our spirit so high, and in the end, it didn't work out. And surprisingly, the Iraqi army, for once, did a very good job, a very, very good job in putting out this offensive. Although, despite the Kurdish forces not being as disciplined in this case, but it was a very good defense, and the Iraqi army was outnumbered, and they were not expecting such an offensive. But indeed, it was quite an episode.
Yeah, I think
Back to you.
strategically it was really well conducted. I mean, I don't think anyone can argue that this was not well conducted. The pincer movements and all that, but the minutia of the tactics aside, I think that this is going to have a lasting effect with the PKK in terms of their influence on the region. You know, before we kind of saw that the PKK wasn't really a force to be reckoned with in Iraq, but now people are kind of looking towards them as the last hope, the last bastion of Kurdish independence, or at least reclaiming some territory that they've lost recently, because they've lost hope in Barzani. At least a large chunk of the population has, and like I said, I think what they were riding on was a reputation as fighters, and the general population was like, this is going to be easy. The Iraqi army is incompetent. Our fighters are well known as being aggressive and being able to hold competence, but the dynamic has completely shifted. I can't think of a more strategic and political blunder than what has happened recently. It is just a mess.
Oh, indeed, it was quite an episode we had there. And what's more interesting is how this is going to play out again, not only for Iraq, but in the aftermath of this referendum and this offensive. So we had these very high spirits on the Kurdish side, and well, they failed, and pretty much all hope started to shatter. Not only on the Barzani family, which has been ruling Kurdish affairs for the past 2 decades, but we also had all these fighters, the Peshmerga fighters, the PKK fighters, which had been seen as these ideal Kurdish militias, these ideal Kurds, not only by Kurds but by throughout the West. So this is where it really gets interesting, and so far we cannot really say, but we can guess, and this is what we'll be talking about today.
Yeah, in my personal opinion, the outcomes of this are going to be a referendum is null and void, and we're not going to see independence anytime soon. This has pretty much entirely crushed the prospects of that happening. Um, which I mean, I don't mean to sound cynical or happy. It's just reality is that once you have a crushing defeat like that, there's no coming back anytime soon. I know a lot of Kurds are hoping that the PKK are gonna, swoop in and liberate Kirkuk and have this massive victory that's gonna shift the tides, but I don't see it happening realistically. The Iraqi army seems extremely competent now. I would assume that a lot of that has to do with Iran and their military advisors coming in, but that's just speculation, obviously.
Oh, that truly is, and well, maybe the Iraqi army is truly getting somewhere lately. It's been doing their homework, and after almost 2 decades of instability. It obviously has hardened them up, not 2 decades, but 15 years. So, what I'm more concerned by now is diplomatically, because these referendums, as we discussed earlier, they're not worth anything. They were not worth anything then to the international community, at least institutionally, and they're not worth now, especially after the defeat. So even if the West, and by the West, the only two countries that support an independent Kurdish state are Israel and the United States right now. Of course, many countries of the European Union do so, and but not as much as those two. They they uh, they have a sympathy for Kurdistan and of course the principle of self-determination, but they wouldn't put their hand so close to the fire to defend a country that they see very, very little strategic value. Again, not referring to Israel or the United States, these two would see a lot of strategic value in an independent and docile Kurdistan.
I would
So,
argue that
but,
in regards to the U.S., they've spent so much money on the Iraqi government, not only from a monetary standpoint, but from a propaganda standpoint. They've tried to prop up Iraq as this liberated, democratic country, and that it kind of goes with the goal of the U.S. invasion is that they got to have this rhetoric and this talking line. So if they've invested so much in Iraq, they can't risk destabilizing the country to a point where it's just a failed state, And some would argue that it is a failed state already, but I mean even further, Afghanistan level of failed state. They also have such large resources in terms of like a military outpost and forward bases that I just don't feel like Kurdistan could provide those same types of resources. Just thinking about it, why would the U.S. try to side with Kurdistan if they're not going to have the same type of GDP, they're not going to have the same type of resources to build bases and house, all these soldiers and equipment. So I think that it's in the U.S.'s best interest to keep Iraq stable until they no longer need it, obviously, and that Kurdistan is more beneficial. But as of right now, I don't think it is.
no, I agree with you greatly. I mean, it's not the main priority of the United States to have a Kurdish state. And of course, they put so much effort in Iraq, and why would they just open up or given up all these investments there just for a Kurdish state? But we have to see that Kurdistan, like it or not, is somewhat more stable right now than the rest of Iraq as a region, and as of civil civil living conditions. The main problem is that if we are to take Kurdistan out of Iraq and kind of save what's a little bit less destroyed, that would bring Iraq down, or maybe actually be better for Iraq. That's what the White House has been discussing a lot. As we've seen before, they have many, many, many plans for reshaping borders in the Middle East, and Kurdistan, in that sense, would come as one of the main priorities right now, because it's there. It has been much more recognized and much more delimited than the other regions of as of now. Not to say that these other regions are not in some trouble, but Kurdistan indeed has been voicing itself and trying to foster sympathy from the international community for quite a long time. But we'll see. As you said, the United States wouldn't really put it as a first priority above all to have an independent Kurdistan. But if they could, and if there was a very good breach, and if let's say the Kurds had this very good referendum and they started winning and winning and winning, then it would become too much loud of a noise to ignore. Then probably the United States would side with the Kurds in this matter, which then we would see as Turkey, Iran, and of course the government of Iraq would start intervening as well. So probably the US, especially under Trump, wouldn't really have the guts to put their hand on this bonfire just for a state that's not their one of their favorites, so to speak.
Yeah, I think once it becomes strategically and monetarily beneficial for the U.S. to side with Kurdistan, I think they'll throw their full support. I mean, just like anything else, we saw this with Saddam. Once it was a burden, they abandoned him, just like they do many other times. But that's just politics. But I mean, particularly on what you said about the Kurdish PR in the international community, how they've been, fostering their reputation. I think that you also see it a lot with Iraqis. I've spoken to a lot of people that say, Kurds have had it rough. They readily admit it, but they just see the division of Iraq kind of as just a blunder, and it shouldn't be done. Even you can feign sympathy for the Kurds and still realize that this is just a terrible idea. But moving on from that, I don't see this as feasible at all in the slightest. Do you see any type of path for Kurdish independence that is reasonable and realistic?
I mean, if we did, we wouldn't be saying it, right? um, Indeed, that's a problem because if you want to consider democratic means of self-determination, a referendum would be what most countries would go for. But even more mature democracies like Spain, they are having their referendums on Catalonia. Catalonia is having the referendum themselves, but in Spain. And well, that's not going very far. And we're talking about an European Union member country with a quite well, not a very long tradition in democracy, but a much more mature democracy than what we have in Iraq today. And so we can see that perhaps the Kurdish path to independence is not through democracy alone. They would have to take up arms, and they are doing so. It's undeniable. But even then, how are they going to get their independence? They start conquering cities. Well, that would be a way to go. But that wouldn't be very well seen throughout the international community, not at all. And that's if they start taking cities and start making noise, which they're not. So it's a tricky question, and I don't see how that could happen so much in the near future. I mean, the situation is not as unstable as it was before. What we could see is they reshaping their image, and they have been doing that quite well lately. To be this from an oppressed people fighting for freedom, and from that perspective, then gathering enough support from the international community, and to really uh, force, or not necessarily force, but to put up with Turkey, to put up with those countries that do not want the Kurdish independence, and really press for the Kurdish state. But that's very unlikely, and very few countries would really want to do that in in any particular moment.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, like I was talking about strategic value, Turkey is a pretty reliable, well, not reliable, I suppose. It's more of a important resource. America launches a lot of air attacks and a lot of missions out of Turkey. So if it was just Iran that was upset about this, that'd be one thing. America would be able to meditate this a lot easier. But because you have a NATO member that is not going to allow this to happen, I don't think there's any reasonable or realistic approach to Kurdish independence, unless, like you said, they took up arms and started taking over cities. But even then, they would be crushed immediately from the might of four different countries. So it's just a mess. I guess that's the best closing that we have, is that if you take away anything from this discussion, it's that Kurdistan is a mess, Iraq is a mess, and nothing's ever going to happen. So this has been a productive discussion regarding the outcome of the
Yeah.
Middle East and Kurdistan.
Well, I wouldn't say nothing's going to happen
No, I
because
know.
something eventually, and that's the problem. And well, so far we can only wait, and we can say that right now, after this defeat, the Kurdish forces are shattered. They're not really going to try anything too bold, or or at least not now. And that was it. The all the high morale and all the hype the Kurds have been having after the referendum just just died out with this defeat, and now they will not really garner as much um, influence or really reason to go to any longer in this in
Yeah, I
this.
mean, it's. I was exaggerating, obviously. There's going to be more repercussions, but in terms of a referendum a referendum being held again or any type of independence movement. It's only going to happen through force, and I don't see that being realistic either. So, with that being all said, I'd like to hear what the audience has to say about this. Voice your opinions. Tell us what you think we were right or wrong about. I'm open to criticism. But any closing words, Tarek?
Well, this was quite a ride. I have to apologize because this is our first podcast, and I don't know if we're being professional enough already. I hope we will improve in the near future. But if I can say anything, it was I have to thank all of you for listening, and we hope to improve and to have a more engaged and a wider audience in the future. And please voice your concerns, voice your opinions, voice your questions, ideas for any next podcast. They are more than welcome. And then again, thanks for listening.
Yep, pretty much the same thing. Thank you so much for listening. We're going to try to improve. This is our first podcast, as Tarek said. Anything that you think we should improve upon, any small critiques, the way that we speak, format, anything like that, let us know so we can improve. This has been enjoyable, and I hope to hear from the audience, and hopefully you guys have some good questions that we can use on the next podcast. So that's it. Take care, everybody.